All right, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Of course, we've been hitting hard the media days across the country with the SEC, the Big 12, and the ACC going on this week. The Big 10 and the Pac-12 will start up next week. Mike Laval joins us from Last Word on College Football. Of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel, where we bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the nation, such as Mike here. Mike, how you doing today?
Mark, always a pleasure. Doing
Yeah,
fantastic.
definitely.
Excited for the unofficial start of college football.
This is pretty much it for us real geeks and nerds and hardcore fans that dig into it pretty much all season. I think it's just some new rhetoric, new voices, new comments to latch on to give some kind of life to the off season to get us started. So it has turned into that unofficial launch or kickoff to the season, and the SEC has led the way and continues to when it comes to the biggest and the most hype and the most attended and so forth. Of course, this also plays into the way it's covered, the way it's perceived, and the way the communication flow goes from players and coaches directly to the public, or in the past, more indirectly to the public. And just your thoughts about the coverage of the event.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, and I think SEC Media Days kind of is the example, the epitome of this example with the changing nature of sports journalism. Back in the day, we use that term, but the previous generation of sports journalism, you really required your local media and your beat writers to be in the program for fans to see that. Fans really couldn't get an organic feel of the program and really had very little direct communication with the program, be it players or coaches or even administration. And I think what you've seen with SEC Media Days and what they've done over the past 10 years, particularly with the advent of the SEC network, technology has enabled the fans to communicate, or really the coaches in the programs, the coaches and the players to communicate directly with the fans, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat. Some of these teams have really good social media managers. Clemson in particular is probably the best social media program in the nation, but also the big companies, ESPN with SEC Network. So now what you have is a situation where every fan, if he or she wants, can watch every minute of SEC Media Days. They don't have to rely on the local media guys and the beat reporters to go there, watch it, cover it, write stories, and then distribute that in the local newspapers. So I think that's really changing the dynamic of sports journalism. The local media who serve an invaluable purpose, particularly before the days of 100 or 500 cable channels. The local fan or the fans had to put their trust in the local media, and the local media really helped shape that program in the eyes of the fans. Coaches knew that, program administrators knew that, and players knew that. They knew that to get that image across to the fans, they had to work with the local media guys. Now with ESPN having 7, 8, 9, 10 channels, whatever, SEC Network, all the conferences have their own networks. Now the fans can see every minute. The coaches and players and administrators don't need necessarily to work through the local media to get to fans. They can shape their own narrative. They can speak directly, either by way of SEC Network or Big 12 Network or Pac-12 Network. They can speak directly to the fans through social media and through this coverage. And so you really so it really puts the local media guys in a bind. How do they get that value back from the local readers, and how do they get that value back, and how they get the trust back from the local readers? It empowers the fan, because now the fan has more information than he or she has ever had. As an independent blogger, it helps me out because I can have access to much more information than I would have previous to social media. But I think the real implication here is the danger of the big companies. Now, with ESPN owning SEC Network and the conference networks, they control what the average person sees, and so they've kind of gobbled up the the predominance, or they control what is distributed on all those networks. So when you have a conglomerate that owns 8, 9, 10 sports channels, it's great for the fan who can pick and choose and see anything he wants to see. But the fans also need to realize that while we've marginalized the local media, we've also kind of put our blind trust and blind faith in the fact that what's being shown to us is controlled by the people who own the product, own the sport of college football. And while I've always advocated that the conferences really own the product of college football, you have to recognize the inextricable link between the conferences and the 2 or 3 prime networks that really drive the information and the platforms that we see all of this coverage on. So, SEC Media Days to me kind of really exemplifies that. ESPN showing it on SEC Network live through the complete duration. The SEC has kind of made it a big event right there at the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta. Big marquees, and it's a big deal. 4 days, I believe the Pac-12 is 1 day. I don't know how they get all 14 coaches in 1 day. The SEC takes it 4 days to get their 14 coaches. But they've made it a media experience. It's accessible to the fans. But part of the reason they've done that is to appease the SEC network and drive the value of that to essentially their co-owners of the product, ESPN Network and by extension, or I'm sorry, SEC Network and by extension ESPN. So it's always interesting for me during SEC Media Days to kind of see how another year has evolved sports journalism. And I think the SEC Media Days kind of more than anything else in college football exemplifies the impact of the digital world on sports journalism.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, bringing you conference media days across the country. Mike specifically covering the SEC, although he's certainly taken a view on the entire landscape here with this thought about the coverage of the events. We're covering the SEC, the Big 12, and, of course, the ACC this week. Mike, I don't understand the approach of the Pac-12. So you're basically sending a message that you're inferior, that there's not that much interest in you because you only need to go to the podium one time. You make it difficult for the media that covers the league to cover all the teams. So if you're based in San Francisco and you cover Cal and Stanford and you're focused on them, that's great. But this is one of the few times over the course of the season or off season that league sources, and I speak from experience, media that covers the entire league but focuses on 1 or 2 schools, normally week to week during the season, takes a broader approach to speak to opponents, to speak to and look forward to games that are going to be played in October and November within the league, and you get coverage in the markets that you don't normally do. You get the Los Angeles guys speaking about Stanford and Cal and so forth and so on, and I'm probably blowing this out to too large of markets, but you get the Knoxville guys talking about Ole Miss for a day and so forth and so on, because that's what I did and that's what the people around me did at that point. So I don't understand the approach of the Pac-12 from sending a message that we're not up to the par of the other conferences. Number 2, we're making it more difficult on our media. Number 3, the cost can't be that prohibitive of making it 1 day instead of 3 or 4. I would think that that's not a huge deal. You've got a Pac-12 network. You've got a vehicle, and this is your biggest sport. Even though the other minor sports are a little bit further along and in competition with football, as opposed to some of the bigger conferences or the more acclaimed football conferences like the SEC and the Big Ten, it's still by far the biggest sport on the board. So why are you minimizing it when your network is starved for legitimate material, live coverage of your most popular sport? It makes absolutely no sense to me why the Pac-12 would approach it this way.
Particularly with the Pac-12 network, because that's the only network that's conference owned. So you would think that they would try to drive the value of the network because they don't necessarily have to appease an owner of their network like the SEC and the Big Ten network do, and the ACC by extension, both with ESPN with the SEC. But I think that's a great question. You should ask Tony Siracusa the next time you have him on. He'd be able to give you a much more insightful answer. But you're right. But I think probably the crux of the issue with the Pac-12 is their perception maybe that their audience can't sustain 48 or 72 hours of coverage, and their audience would be more captivated with just 24-hour coverage. I do think there's probably cost there. I think with the SEC, I think probably the SEC network and ESPN helps drive the capability of them having a 4-day event in Atlanta at the College Football Hall of Fame. Maybe Pac-12 doesn't think that the cost of a multi-day media days is a good investment. It would be a good investment and would show a return on the value of their network. That's really the only thing I can think of, is that the Pac-12 doesn't think that investment of multiple days would show a good return for their network.
Okay, they know a whole lot more than I do about the geography, the landscape of the fans, the interest of the fans, their own budgetary concerns and expenses. But I may agree that the investment is not going to be returned within the next week, but the long-term investment of making that commitment to your media days when this is the driving force of the hype, of the anticipation, and the news churn that gets started about a month before the college football season, I think is insane not to invest in the news cycle and in getting your league out in front of that and trying to publicize, especially again, when we both acknowledge that it's a independently run network that is starving for good quality content, especially this time of year. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, back to your first point concerning the role of the beat reporter and what it was even 15 years ago, and certainly before that. But now that the internet has really taken hold and been established as the primary source for almost everyone. And of course, these news outlets they've made the transition from the physical newspaper to online, but there's so much competition that the thing that comes to mind that makes it even more difficult for the sports outlets versus a news outlet is, yes, news junkies can get their news directly, similar to what you describe on the sports scale. However, most of the people that make the news, that are the news creators, the centerpiece of the news, they are not necessarily ones that want that news to be out there in the news realm, because typically news is bad news. And yes, Twitter, Facebook, all the social media platforms have made news people wanting to take in news much more adept and quickly being able to take in their news. But it's still news reporting. It's people that are on the scene, on the site, within close proximity, but they're not the actual news makers. Where in this case, most of the time, and certainly at SEC Media Days and Media Days in general, we're hearing directly from the news makers, and those are the players and the coaches. So it's unfiltered completely.
Yeah, I think the implication there, particularly at the national media level, is it drives kind of it drives a hesitation almost for the media, who must rely. So in the previous paradigm, the programs, the coaches, the players had to rely on the local media and the beat reporters and the national media to a certain extent to drive or to get their narrative out to the fans, to get their message out to the fans. I think today, when coaches and programs can speak directly to the fans, you almost have seen a reversal of the paradigm where the reporters, the local reporters, and some of the national media rely on the programs, and the coaches rely on them relying on the programs to give them access to their program to kind of drive their brand. So we've almost seen a 180-degree shift in the paradigm between local media and some national media, really the opinion columnist of the national media, almost a 180-degree paradigm shift of where the programs used to be dependent on those guys, and now those local media and the national opinion columnists are really kind of dependent on the programs to give them access, more access than what the programs are giving via social media and digital means to the fans. So we've almost, I think we've kind of seen maybe a 180-degree shift on that paradigm, and I think it creates some interesting situations in sports journalism across the nation, and specifically in some local markets as well.
Yeah, and it really puts pressure on those specific writers to either be entertaining or to come up with some kind of angle on a consistent basis that is completely unique and to them. And otherwise, the population that they gain and the subscribers and the people that read on a regular basis would have to be drawn to just the convenience of having all that, all those sound bites, all the news conferences, everything condensed down into an article that they can read, even if it's not that interesting or that unique. At least they have a one-stop shop. Otherwise, yes, the writer now has to be unique or has to be funny or interesting in some way to captivate an audience, because otherwise it can be directly accessed. The other thing that may be wearing off at this point, but I still think certainly grabbed people's attention when they were first laying hold of the internet as a news source, or in this case, a sports news source, is that just the rawness of getting those sound bites or that video of a Nick Saban walking down the hall, and it's uncut and it's unfiltered and it's just there. It's your 27 seconds of Nick Saban. Maybe you hear him say something, and that just seems so more authentic and real and genuine and kind of edgy than what's kind of cleaned up and presented later by some of the major services.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's part of the value that former players bring into this market is, they have that insight of what really goes on in a locker room 24/7. I think that's why you see the addition of players, particularly NFL Network and across the media landscape in the last 10 or 15 years. You see a lot more former players getting in the booth and getting up on the desk for your pregame and postgame shows. And I think that's why, because they add that remaining a little bit of authenticity that you lose or that you don't have with today's inundated digital environment.
I left traditional media, at least in front of the camera, at a time when the internet was certainly functional and it was there, but it wasn't the first thought. The first thought was to still grab the media guide and run through it, and we had stacks of them sitting next to us, and that was the number one source. And I had to kind of teach myself the last couple of years I was in front of the camera for an affiliate to think, okay, I'm starting to rely on and get used to the ease of finding these particular sites. And it was just very mainstream, the SEC.com or whatever the title was, the location. Yeah, I was making that transition, and this was sometime around 2000. And that's what was in play at this point. And then it only took a few years where the information sources completely, the reliance on them completely switched.
Well, I think you've got the podcast down.
Well, I don't know if I've got it down, but we work hard at it. I can say that for sure. We got Michael Vall.
I see your readership number is growing every day, so I think you got it down.
Yeah, well, that's good to see. So I thank a lot of people out there that are boosting this by the day, and things are increasing in all categories. So that's nice to see. We got Mike Laval on the line from Last Word on College Football. And as we approach the SEC season and all the major conferences, of course, you want to check Mike and the rest of the crew out at Last Word on College Football. So, Mike, what were you able to pick up along the way in your surfing of the internet and the channels in regards to what was discussed today, and maybe even Monday and Tuesday?
Yeah, so I think some interesting stuff from today. Nick Saban is Nick Saban. He's going to go through this. with a forced grin on. Not much new out of there. I thought it was interesting. He again, as he does every year, got a little bit frustrated with some of the questions, particularly about redshirting one of his quarterbacks, and so there was some. You're starting to see a little bit tougher questions from the media assembled there in Atlanta, particularly with Saban, and that's good. Nothing really there. I thought Barry Odom I think of all the coaches who returned, I thought Barry Odom looked a little bit different. I had a piece published yesterday about who I thought was going to be the surprise team out of the SEC, and I think it's going to be Missouri. I think they're going to finish second in the SEC East. But I thought Barry Odom kind of today looked much more confident than he's looked in the past SEC media days. I thought he looked like a coach who knew what he had and was happy that he was kind of flying under the radar. He had that quiet confidence to him, which kind of makes me think that maybe Missouri will be the surprise team out of the SEC East this year. A tremendously potent offense. I think their defense is going to be underrated. I think they're going to get back to where an Odom defense should be, particularly with Terry Beckner Jr. and their transfer defensive tackle from Texas. But I think Odom had that quiet confidence about him that you can sometimes pick up in a coach. I thought Jeremy Pruitt, I'm a Tennessee guy. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Charlie Burris says later tonight on MarkRogersTV. I thought Jeremy Pruitt was a breath of fresh air. He's a guy that you can tell is concerned only about football. He's not going to have the cliches or the smoothness. I thought the biggest thing about Jeremy Pruitt was the players he brought to SEC media days with him. He really didn't bring the Tennessee stars. He didn't bring Darren Kirkland Jr., Todd Kelly Jr., Nigel Warrior, Shai Tuttle, Daniel Batuli. He didn't bring either one of the quarterbacks. He didn't bring Jawan Jennings. He brought three guys who are kind of quiet in demeanor. The biggest star among them is Marquez Callaway. If you polled SEC fans and asked which team does Marquez Callaway, Eli Wolf, or Kyle Phillips play for, I'm not sure fans in the SEC, particularly for the last two, I'm not sure you would get 50% of fans who would know that Kyle Phillips or Eli Wolf play for Tennessee. So I really thought that really kind of was the biggest takeaway for me, is he brought those quiet leaders, locker room leaders, and guys, particularly with Eli Wolf, who have worked really hard in the weight room and developmental wise since he's taken over, which is another message to the fan base there is, he's focusing on the weight room. In Tennessee, health has been a tremendous issue the last 2 years, and guys who are working and develop and who are developing, which was the biggest complaint against Butch Jones, is that he brought in great talent but just never developed them. So I'm super eager to see what Charlie Burris has to say tonight. One other thing on Pruitt is Pruitt's a guy who is not using the Tennessee brand to build his personal brand like Butch Jones did. To a lot of fans, it felt like Butch Jones was using the Tennessee brand to build the Butch Jones brand. With Jeremy Pruitt, I think it's the opposite. I think Jeremy Pruitt is subjugating his brand to the Tennessee brand. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of Tennessee fans, maybe subconsciously, but I think it's going to resonate very well with Tennessee fans. Again, really eager to see what Charlie has to say tonight on MarkRogersTV. Barry Odom, I thought, was quiet confidence, kind of the same. I thought Chad Morris yesterday was kind of, if you talk about a coach who maybe didn't meet expectations, I thought Chad Morris was that guy. If you talk about a coach who maybe exceeded expectations, I think Barry Odom's that guy. But by and large, so far, kind of what we expect and what we've come to know from SEC media days, it's a little bit more of a process and formality than any hard-hitting event, certainly. Certainly, we don't see a lot of seismic statements made there at media days.
Yeah, Mike, despite our narrative over the last 2 days, I've had to rely a little bit more on the talking heads than I typically do, than the actual rhetoric coming right directly from the podium or the interview itself. So I'll speak to some of that without going into deep specifics. Paul Feinbaum took a pretty large hit at a shot at Butch Jones for much of what you just spoke about, of him being kind of a carnival huckster of sorts, versus Jeremy Pruitt being taking command, maybe presenting himself better than expected, is not a coordinator type, just a football coach, but a guy that can lead a program into the future. And of course, yeah, I was impressed with Barry Odom. I think the hire of Derek Dooley as offensive coordinator gained a lot of attention and a lot of talk during this particular day. And I know I saw Drew Lock interviewed a couple different times. He was asked about it. Of course, he's going to say all the right things. He's going to point the finger at himself to improve despite the glossy, prolific statistics last year. He took ownership of the offense, saying, hey, it's going to be on me to not only throw up numbers, but now make even better plays in key situations. And it's time for us to compete with some of the teams on our schedule that we haven't competed with in the past. That certainly came to mind. Of course, Nick Saban questioned, as you mentioned, about the quarterback battle and what stands there. And of course, he was very irritated by that line of questioning. And speaking of the line of questioning, the very first thing you said about what Nick Saban was met with kind of speaks to the new age of journalism and the pressure or the challenge of reporters to ask pertinent questions. I know that when I, again, was in the arena, and certainly way before me, that, and I'm sure it still goes on to a certain extent, there was a thought process by a lot of people, hopefully not myself, but you could just throw out a topic and you just wanted a coach or a player to talk about blank, and you didn't have to ask a pointed question. You would just say, man, you guys really stepped up in the fourth quarter. Bam. And you would let them just take it wherever they wanted, and that was lazy journalism. And maybe there's a little bit less of that because of the competition out there and not the monopoly that the beat writers have in those particular markets.
Yeah, I think the evolution of the questions asked at SEC Media Days speaks to that as well. Over the past 3 or 4 years, fans have been consistent in their description of the questions being asked, and then they've on social media they've been very expressive of the fact that they thought the questions were softball and cupcake questions to the coaches. And in the last 2 years, Paul Feinbaum last year kind of got sideways of Nick Saban for a question he asked afterwards, but still on the SEC network. And this year we're seeing a couple more hard-hitting questions for the coaches. So I think the journalists who are there have responded to the fans' critiques of their questions at SEC Media Days. And again, I think that speaks to the changing dynamics, the evolution of sports journalism, particularly in college football. I think those are some great examples. I will tell you on the Drew Lock thing, Drew Lock had a comment today about how Derek Dooley's very particular about the sandwich layout of the offensive meetings. Again, that's a highlight of why Dooley is a head scratcher of a hire for Barry Odom. That's the same stuff that derailed the Tennessee program. Derek Dooley being micromanaging the hygiene program and teaching history lessons. I wrote in my article yesterday about Missouri being a surprise team that the only coach in the SEC that's going to be able to stop Drew Lock and that Tigers offense this season is going to be his own offensive coordinator, Derek Dooley. And if that happens, it will be a shame for Drew Lock, who is a tremendous talent in Columbia. He's a quarterback at Missouri who can win them a couple of SEC games on his own. He's a talent, and I'm just deathly afraid for Missouri fans that Derek Dooley is going to ruin Drew Lock's senior season.
At one point,
his comment today was
go right ahead.
His comment today was, to me, a tremendous warning sign that they're going to get the same Derek Dooley that coached at Tennessee.
So David Pollack and Greg McElroy in some of their comments, and those are guys that admittedly they watch during the course of the season. They've got to focus on the games that they're covering and the bigger teams, and they're locked in there. They're not watching a whole lot of Missouri football until they have to, and that they really caught up on Drew Lock during the off season and studying the tape, and both of them are just overly impressed with Drew Lock and just feel that he's just outright the best quarterback in the league.
Yeah, again, I kind of ran down stats. Check out Last Word on collegefootball.com. Posted a surprise SEC team article yesterday. And it's Missouri. And it's because of Drew Lock. He had 41% more passing touchdowns than the second highest quarterback in the SEC last year. I think the number, his passing yards off the top of my head, I think he had 21% more passing yards than the second-ranked passing yardage leader in the SEC last year. He wasn't just statistically the best quarterback in the SEC last year. He was by far the best quarterback statistically in the SEC last year. to me, when I watch Missouri, he looks like a small guy, but when you look at him, he's actually 6'3", I believe, 225, 230 pounds. He's got great stature for a quarterback. I think when you're looking for a dark horse Heisman candidate, a dark horse candidate to be an NFL draft #1 pick, I think at the end of the season, we're going to be talking a lot about Drew Lock. I would not be surprised if Missouri wins 9, possibly even 10 games. That's how good I think that offense can be, and it's all going to center around him. Again, I am so afraid for my Missouri friends who are fans of that team that Derek Dooley is going to ruin that. But
so, Mike, you're forecasting a big season, but at the same time, you're putting out the warning signs about a Derek Dooley-led offense.
Yeah, because all the empirical evidence supports Missouri having a surprise breakout season. 2 really good running backs, neither one of which are stars, but they're both really good running backs. A tremendous wide receiver core, the best returning tight end in the SEC, who is a matchup nightmare. The guy is, I believe, 6'4", 250 pounds. He's just a tremendous athlete, freakish athlete. Best returning quarterback by far. I believe they have all 5 offensive linemen returning. 2 former 5-star guys on defensive tackle, one of which is not getting much media play because he's a transfer from Texas, sit out last year. Again, their linebackers are a lot like their running backs. No big-time star there, but all 3 return and all 3 are really good. Terez Hall, I believe, is number 3 returning linebacker in the league on tackles per attempt. So I believe last year, I think 93% of the times he had an opportunity to make a tackle, he made that tackle. The one thing on paper where Missouri should be kind of be wary is their defensive secondary. But in the SEC East, they're not going to face a lot of tremendous passing teams. So if you're going to be weak in one area, that's probably the area to be weak. I'm just having the firsthand experience with Derek Dooley at Tennessee, seeing Drew Lock's comments today about him being particular about the sandwich board. I really think that the only coach in the SEC that's going to stop Drew Lock this year is Derek Dooley, unless he's gotten better as a coach, quite frankly.
So the key there for Lock's Heisman candidacy, in my eyes, is to win the games that you're supposed to. So dominate Kentucky and Vandy and some of those games, maybe get that game against South Carolina that you need. Maybe he pulls off the one big upset against the South Carolina team that's supposed to be better. And then Georgia, Alabama, you're not going to win those games, especially the Bama game. But, man, if he would light up the Bama secondary and lose even if it's a 2 or 3 score game, if it's 45-31 and he just throws for 400 yards and looks great against the Bama defense and they go 8-4, 9-3, maybe that's his ticket to New York.
Yeah, he doesn't have to beat Alabama. All he has to do is more against Alabama than anyone else does, particularly Jake Fromm. Georgia's not playing Alabama this year, but particularly Jarrett Stidham. If he can separate himself from Jarrett Stidham using the Alabama game as a common measuring stick, that'll do well. They've got a pretty interesting game with Purdue. They have to travel to Purdue second week of the season. We're going to know whether or not Missouri's going to be a surprise team in week 2. Remember last year they had a horrible start. 1-5, I believe. They looked very poor against Purdue and then against I believe South Carolina in week 4 last year. We'll know that Purdue game whether or not they are going to be a surprise team. They also have another tough out of conference game with Memphis this year. So Drew Lock, that's going to be a chance for that defense to win a game because we know Drew Lock's going to have success against Memphis's defense, but can Missouri's defense stop that Mike Norville-led Memphis offense? So again, that'll be another data point of whether Missouri is going to be a big-time surprise team this year.
That Purdue defense was one of the under-the-radar stories from last season that actually propelled them to 7 wins and a bowl win. They beat Mizzou 35-3, as you mentioned, which seems unfathomable against that quarterback and that offense. But that Purdue defense lost a ton, and the replacements aren't supposed to be as good. So we'll see how it plays out there in West Lafayette. Want to remind everyone that at 8 o'clock Eastern time, we've got Charlie Burris on the line from the Orange and White Report to talk Tennessee football at SEC Media Days. Then we've got 9 o'clock West Virginia talk, Big 12 overall from Big 12 country at 10 o'clock. And believe me, I've got a list of guests and contributors that I'm just trying to slot at this point for the next few days. And of course, Mike Laval leading off tonight from Last Word on College Football. Mike, unless you've got anything else, I will let you go.
No, thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. I encourage all the fans to check us out at lastwordoncollegefootball.com. You can find me at MikeL_LWS on Twitter. Appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of Media Days.